Welcome back, Blenderheads! This is Jamie Dunbar from Dragon Boot Studios, and this is part 3 and the final chapter in the Sculpting Lapras series. Now, this video was mostly meant to be about rigging and posing and rendering Lapras here, but I have to admit this wave that Lapras ended up riding, it took me forever to create, and it takes up a good chunk of this video. And it probably took me about an extra week or so to make it, which is why this video took a little bit longer than I would have liked. Fun fact about whale anatomy. Now, because whales are technically mammals, not fish, they have an almost identical skeleton to us humans. Admittedly, there's, bones and stuff are in slightly different places and different sizes, but the actual bone structure itself, almost identical. So that means that these flippers here have a very similar bone structure to our arms. And yes, that means that whales technically have finger bones, which is kind of a strange concept. Now, in our case, we don't actually need that level of detail, so I didn't bother to create the actual finger bones, but we're still going to create this shoulder, arm, and forearm bones, as well as the hand bone. Quick tip, you can use Shift F2 to bring up this little panel and rename a bunch of objects all at once. This allows me to very quickly rename all the spine bones all in one go. Now, since I know I'm not planning to animate Lapras and I just need a single pose for this final render, I create a very bare bones rig here. Sorry for the pun. We really only need the flippers, spine, and tail controls and the ability to open and close the mouth. Later on, I also add some additional eye controls. It's always a good idea to name all of your bones, otherwise figuring out which bones need to be weight painted can be an absolute nightmare later on, especially when you've got a character that's got so many spine bones and tail bones. The automatic weights do a really spectacular job here. The jaw and the shell still need a little bit of tweaking, but mouth areas almost always need a little bit of tweaking. I deliberately try to paint the lower jaw here so that I can get a little fat fold at the top of the neck. Testing your weight paints can be a difficult task. I found the best way is to pose your character in some of the more extreme positions you expect that they'll end up in, and adjust your weight paints to fit that. If your weight paints hold up in these extreme poses, it's more likely that they'll hold up in some more standard poses too. Your job at this stage is to try and break your rig, so don't do standard casual poses, push your rig to its breaking limits. The most common feedback I received from the previous texturing video was that the eyes were too cartoony compared to the rest of the sculpt, which was definitely a fair critique. So although this means remaking the eyes for a third time here, it really does need to be done. Because Lapras has such triangular eye socket shapes, I need to use a more advanced eye rigging method. This involves using a mesh deform modifier to reshape the eyeball. What's awesome about the mesh deformer, rather than just reshaping the eye in edit mode, is that as you roll the eye around in the head, it dynamically deforms to keep its new shape, this new triangular shape. This allows the eye texture to look as though it's sliding across the surface of the eye. Now, the downside to this method is that the eye texture gets deformed and Lapras starts to look a little bit derpy. So I need to use the object setting in my texture coordinates node to give it back its circular shape and remove this strange stretching that's going on. Hopefully all of this looks relatively straightforward, but these oddly shaped eyes took me ages to figure out, and I tried all sorts of UV projection techniques to stop the eye texture from deforming strangely. Now we have the shape of the eyes correct, it's time to rig them. To do this, you need to parent the eyeballs to these new eye bones, but you want to parent the mesh deformer cubes to the head. If you parent both of these to the eye bones, the eyeballs will shoot out of their sockets when they roll around, and that's just really creepy. Now, trying to control the eyes by rotating these first two bones is a little finicky, so I create a couple of extra bones that we can constrain our eye bones to point towards. To achieve this, we use the track 2 constraint. And finally, because I want to move both eyes at once, I create a third bone to parent the two eye controllers to, and then parent that to the head. Don't forget to add a few subdivision modifiers to your eyes to ensure that they're smooth in the final render, but disable them in the viewport, otherwise you slow down all of your posing. I do the same thing to Lapras's body and to the shell, just to speed up everything a little bit. While testing the jaw controller here, I realized that the inside of Lapras's mouth looks really weird, and that's because I haven't modeled a tongue or teeth yet. I did a little bit of experimenting, and adding the tongue made a huge difference, but the teeth looked kinda weird. No matter what I did, the teeth just made Lapras look vicious and angry, so although it's a little unrealistic, I elected not to have teeth on this character. The tongue model is really simple. For the most part, it's just an extruded cube with a subdivision modifier applied to it, and a little bit of tapering at the ends. The material is also really simple. It's just a noise texture plugged into a color ramp so that you can tweak the colors a little bit and give it this pinky kind of feel. You can use the exact same noise texture to add both a bump map and just to tweak the roughness a little bit, just so you've got a little bit of variation in the specularity here. Because we'll never really be getting a good look at the tongue, I don't really need to spend a lot of time adding a whole heap of details to it. Don't forget to turn off the rendering setting on your mesh deformer objects, otherwise you're going to end up with these strange cube shapes over your character's eyes. With the rigging finished, it's time to build the wave that Lapras will be riding in on. Now, this wave was a nightmare to create. It's probably taken me an extra week to get this video done just because of it. I tried all sorts of methods to get a nice wave. I've tried particle simulations, I've tried fluid simulations, I've tried sculpting it by hand. In the end, I found that the best way to do it is a combination of hand modeling and then adding displacement modifiers to get the best result. The main problem I had with the creation of this wave was that I needed it to be a really specific shape so that I could place Lapras exactly where I wanted to. This makes using simulations really tricky because simulations are awesome for building large-scale chaos, but not so good at building these extremely close-up specific handcrafted shapes. So I knew at the back of the wave I wanted to have it breaking and crashing and creating a bit of foam. In the middle is where I needed it to be at its highest point so that I could fit Lapras inside of it and have her surfing it, and then it just kind of needs to taper out at the end. Water is one of those surfaces that gets affected by anything that it touches or anything that touches it. So it's kind of like cloth or mud, it deforms on contact. Which means that I wanted to get Lapras into position as early as possible, as Lapras would be affecting the water and the water would also be affecting Lapras, meaning that there could be a lot of fiddly work to get the two to work nicely together. I also knew early on that I wanted to have Lapras have one fin poking into the wave. If you've ever seen like some really good surfers, as they're coming down the wave, they kind of reach out their hand and drag it through the wave as they're surfing it. I really wanted to get that kind of impression. Like, this is something that Lapras does all the time, and this is just like a game for her. Here I add a whole heap of extra edge loops because I know that shortly I'm going to be adding a lot of displacement modifiers to get all the wave ripples. Displacement maps need really good topology with lots of square-shaped polygons, not these kind of large, stretched rectangular shapes that I have beforehand. It also makes these little sculpting tweaks I'm making just that little bit more predictable too. Here I add my first displacement modifier. I use the built-in marble texture to get the wave ripples. Annoyingly, the settings here don't have an option for rotating the texture, and I really need these ripples to go in a particular direction. So I have to go back to my modifier and change the texture coordinates to object. Then I can use something like an empty to adjust the texture by rotating and scaling it. This marble texture was really awesome and it gets me about 90% of the way, but I want to add a little bit more random variation to the water, and for that I choose to use the ocean modifier. Not only does this add the randomness I was looking for, but later on I discover it also has some settings to generate foam in the textures, which ends up being absolutely vital in getting the water material to work. Now to access this foam data, you need to give it a name in the foam data layer name section of the modifier. Then you can use the attribute node in the material editor to find the foam. Getting the lighting right on this piece was quite a bit of work. I think it's because I had several different ideas on how I wanted it to look and I hadn't settled on one just yet. I really loved some of the references I looked at where the sun is behind the wave and then the light passing through the water gives this really cool distorted color effects. This makes the wave look stunning, but I have to remember that this piece is ultimately about the character. It's about Lapras, and I need to focus on her. And unfortunately, as much as I really like this lighting, because it's behind her, it throws her face into shadow and kind of turns her into more of a silhouette. So as much as I liked this idea, I ended up abandoning it and going for more of a midday, bright sunshine feel instead. It's not nearly as dramatic, but it is better for representing the character sculpt. If you want to add extra realism to your water, it's worth adding a volume node to your material. This simulates like little dirt particles and stuff in the water, and it gives it that feeling of depth. Just keep in mind that although this works really well for cycles, it doesn't work terribly well in EV just yet. The solidify modifier isn't giving me the exact shape I want, so now that I've tested my material and got that working reasonably well, I go in and manually add depth to the wave. Now that I have my wave looking pretty much how I want it, it's time to add that aquarium look. Ultimately, I wanted to build this piece like it was a toy or a miniature, so I wanted to have the whole scene kind of sitting on a pedestal of some sort. To do that, I need to cut a shape out of the water, kind of like you would in a snow globe. Originally I wanted this pedestal to be made of some kind of rock, as if it were a water fountain or something, but using rock just made it look like it was part of the scene, which then implies that Lapras is in some sort of danger because nobody wants to be surfing amongst the rocks. So later on you'll see that I replace this texture with a more metallic one to avoid this. The circular shape of the pedestal is making it so that the scene is mostly water, and obviously I want the scene to be mostly Lapras. It is a character sculpt after all. So I tweaked the shape to make it more oval and eliminate some of the excess water that's at the front and the back of the wave. I wanted to create a little symbol of a Pokeball to put on the pedestal. Initially I tried modeling it just by eyeballing it, and the shapes, honestly, it just kind of sucked. So I quickly pull in a reference to get the shapes just right. Even for these incredibly simple shapes like this, your eye can kind of play tricks on you, so seriously, just if you can get them, go and use references. Please just use references. Getting objects to follow a curve can be a little bit tricky in Blender. You have to make sure that both the object that you're duplicating and the curve have the same pivot point. Even then, there's times when applying your transformations can distort your object, which you can see here. I'm not sure if I'm missing something or if maybe there's a little bit of a bug in Blender here. Sometimes I find it's just easier to recreate the curve and it just seems to magically fix it. So if you run into this distortion problem, don't be afraid to just redo your curve. It's best to reshape your curve in edit mode rather than scaling it in object mode. It helps to avoid this kind of issue. Here I UV unwrap the wave. I like how the foam that I've created so far has turned out, but I want to manually add some extra foam where Lapras is touching the water. So to do that, we have to hand paint a texture map, and to hand paint a texture map, we have to UV unwrap it first. I paint in some extra details around the flipper, around the tail, and around the crashing part of the wave. Now this bend in the wave makes it a little tricky for me to paint on, so I also do a little bit of cleanup by painting directly onto the texture map. Mixing these two maps allows me to get both a custom hand-painted texture and the power of procedural textures all in one. Since I didn't go to the effort of building a full facial rig, I had a couple of key shapes here so that I can give Lapras a little bit more of a smile. I also tweak her lower eyelids a little bit just to emphasize that smile shape. Using key shapes here is really good as it allows you to add these little bits of extra detail without affecting your original armature and paint weights. And finally, it's time to start setting up the final render. I grab an entirely new HDRI. I believe that this is one of the HDRIs from HDRI-Haven. I believe it is called Lakeside. I'll make sure that there is a link to HDRI-Haven in the description below. They've got stacks of HDRIs, they're all free. Although they do have a Patreon page if anybody is feeling generous enough to donate to them. As well as the HDRI, I add an extra light pointing at Lapras' head from kind of this front view. This is in part to simulate light that would be bouncing up from the ocean, but it's mostly just to add a little bit of extra light on her face. Now, one of the things that I didn't realize early on is that using that foam attribute method, it gives you a really low resolution result. You can really see it when I'm playing with the bump map. The bump map just looks really, really jagged. So to get the full resolution detail, you actually need to bake out the maps from the ocean modifier. Since I was just doing a still render, I could set my start and end times to 1, so it only bakes out a single texture, which saves heaps of time. Now, just to confuse matters even more, the resolution setting in the modifier doesn't directly relate to your texture size. So you don't want to set the resolution to like 1000 by 1000 with the assumption that you would get a 1K map. That will give you an enormous texture and probably crash Blender in the process. I think I actually did manage to crash it at one point. I ended up using a resolution of 40, which gives me a 1600 by 1600 pixel texture, which works fine for my needs. I add some extra detail to the foam by using a Voronoi texture, which when applied as a bump map makes it look a little bit like bubbles. I'm pretty happy with the wave at this point, but it definitely still feels like it's missing something, and that something is that the wave still isn't really interacting with Lapras properly. So as a final step, I decide to add a few particle emitters to simulate the spray that would be coming off Lapras' flippers as she speeds through the water. Initially, I tried doing this with some simple icospheres, but it's not really giving the detail that I want. Instead, I switch over to using metaballs, which kind of dynamically creates a mesh in between all the little ball shapes. This gives the impression of splashes of water being sprayed rather than just, individual little balls that the icospheres do. I also switched from using the ball shape metaball to the capsule shape, which distorts the meta mesh slightly, making it look a little bit like motion blur. Now just a little heads up, having one of these emitters with all these metaballs was fine, but once I duplicated it several times, it did start to slow down my computer a little bit, so use it with caution, save regularly. This kind of detailed simulation does have the potential to crash your scene. Since I don't want to be dealing with all the lag that these particle emitters have created, I turn these particle systems into a polygon mesh. You do this by applying the particle system under the modifiers tab. This makes every single particle in your scene its own object, in this case, a whole bunch of metaballs. You can then select all the metaballs and convert to a mesh. This turns all the metaballs into a single polygon mesh, which as an added bonus means that you can sculpt on it for a little bit of extra detail. And with these water splashes all set up, we're pretty much done. Which means it is now time for the final epic reveal. Big thanks to Tommy Gough for helping me out with the audio. As you're going to hear, he does amazing epic music for video games, cinema and animations, and he was able to turn out this awesome little tune for me in record time. He's very much available for hire, so I'll make sure that there is a link to his website and showreel in the description below. So that's it for the Lapras series. A big thank you to everybody who's followed along and subscribed along the way, because a couple of weeks back the channel hit its first 1,000 subscribers. So to celebrate, I'm planning on doing a live stream event where I'll create another character, live, as live stream kind of implies, as well as allowing anybody present to ask character or Blender related questions that they might have. So keep your eyes peeled, I'll be dropping another video with those details in a few days. Until then.